A pregnant mare, once a symbol of hope, turns into a nightmare, attacking her owner with such force that his ribs are shattered. As the vet ran the ultrasound probe over her swollen belly, his hands suddenly froze. The screen revealed something so unnatural, so utterly terrifying, that he barely managed to whisper, "My God, what is that?" The door slammed open with a deafening crash, and Pedro nearly dropped the sack of grain he was carrying. Standing in the doorway was Marco, the local loan shark, flanked by two burly men who looked like they hadn't smiled in a decade. Marco's dark eyes scanned the room, narrowing as they landed on Pedro. "Where's the money, Pedro?" Marco's voice was sharp, almost mocking. "You promised me last week." "I just need a little more time," Pedro stammered, his voice trembling despite his best effort to stay composed. He set the sack down gently, hands trembling. "The harvest was bad and I don't care about your harvest." Marco stepped forward, boots crunching against the straw-covered floor. "I care about my money. You don't have it? Then I'll take something that does." Before Pedro could react, Marco snapped his fingers. The two men moved fast, like wolves scenting blood. One overturned the wooden table in the corner, sending plates and tools clattering to the ground. The other began tearing open grain sacks, spilling their precious contents onto the floor. "Stop!" Pedro shouted, stepping toward them, his hands outstretched. "Please, I'll find a way. Just give me another month." "Another month?" Marco said, his tone laced with mockery. "That's what you said last time. And the time before that." One of the men turned toward Marta's stall. The mare let out a nervous huff, stamping her hooves against the ground. Pedro's heart froze. "No!" he yelled, rushing forward to block the stall. "Not Marta! She's all I've got left!" Marco smirked, leaning lazily against the doorframe. "All you've got left, huh? Well, maybe I'll take her as collateral. Might fetch a decent price at the auction." Pedro's fists clenched so tight, his nails dug into his palms. "You can't take her. She's more than just a horse. She's family." Marco's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. He took a deliberate step toward Pedro, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "Family doesn't pay debts, Pedro. Money does. If you can't cough it up, I'll start taking what's mine." Behind him, one of the men grabbed a nearby chair and smashed it against the wall for no reason other than to make a point. The sound echoed through the barn like a gunshot, and Marta neighed in alarm, backing into the corner of her stall. "All right! All right!" Pedro shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. He stepped back, his hands raised in surrender. "Just give me 1 month, that's all I ask. I'll get you the money." Marco tilted his head, considering. The tension in the room was palpable, each second stretching longer than the last. 1 month, Marco finally said, his tone deceptively casual. "If I don't have my money by then, you'll lose more than just a horse. Understand?" Pedro nodded silently, his throat too tight to speak. Marco gestured to his men, and they filed out without another word, leaving the barn in shambles. Pedro sank to his knees, staring at the scattered grain and broken furniture. Marta's soft neigh pulled his attention, and he turned to see her watching him, her dark eyes filled with fear. "I'm sorry," Pedro whispered, his voice shaking. "I won't let them take you. I promise." That night, Pedro sat alone by the dim light of a flickering lantern, a pencil in one hand and a piece of worn paper in the other. He scribbled figures furiously, adding and subtracting, trying to find some miracle in the numbers that would save him. No matter how he calculated, the result was the same. He was short. His eyes drifted toward Marta's stall. The mare had finally calmed down, but her unease lingered in every flick of her tail, every nervous glance toward the door. "Everyone says I should sell you," Pedro muttered aloud, as if speaking the thought would make it less real. "But how can I? You're all I've got." The weight of his situation pressed down on him like a stone. He thought of his parents, how they'd built this farm from nothing. Losing it would be losing them, their memory, their sacrifices. And selling Marta, that would be losing himself. But what choice did he have? 2 days later, Pedro found himself leaning against the rough counter of the dimly lit tavern, the faint hum of conversation and clinking glasses doing little to drown out the storm in his mind. He nursed the same mug of watered-down beer he'd been holding for the last hour, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle. The weight of Marco's threats and the impossible numbers on his ledger pressed down on him like a millstone. He stared into the amber liquid, his reflection distorted and unfamiliar. "What am I going to do?" he muttered under his breath. "You look like a man in need of a solution," a smooth voice said from behind. Pedro turned sharply, his eyes landing on a man he didn't recognize. The stranger was well-dressed, too well-dressed for a place like this, with a neatly tailored suit that gleamed faintly in the tavern's dull light. His dark hair was slicked back, and his sharp eyes gleamed with a predatory confidence. "I'm Victor," the man said, slipping onto the stool next to Pedro without waiting for an invitation. His smile was polite, but calculating. Pedro narrowed his eyes. "What's it to you?" Victor raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, my friend. I'm just here to help. I hear you're in a bit of a tight spot." Pedro stiffened. "And how would you know that?" Victor chuckled lightly. "Let's just say I make it my business to know. You've got a farm that's on the brink, a mare you're hoping can save it, and a pile of debts breathing down your neck. Sound about right?" Pedro's jaw tightened. He glanced around the room, suddenly feeling exposed, like everyone was staring at him, though no one was. Victor leaned in, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look, I'm not here to make things harder for you. I specialize in situations like yours, helping folks turn their luck around. And I think I can help you, Pedro." Pedro frowned. "How?" Victor gestured to the bartender for a drink before turning back to Pedro. "Your mare, Marta, right? She's your last hope, isn't she? If she could produce a foal, not just any foal, but a strong, healthy, and valuable one, you could pay off those debts and maybe even have some left over to rebuild." Pedro's eyes narrowed. "You're saying you can make that happen?" Victor nodded, sipping his drink. "Absolutely. I've got years of experience in breeding and fertility. The process I use isn't just standard, it's cutting edge. I can ensure Marta gives birth to a foal worth its weight in gold. All I ask is a modest fee for my services." Pedro stared at the man, suspicion gnawing at him. "Why should I trust you? How do I know this isn't some scam?" Victor smiled again, his expression as smooth as his voice. "You don't. But tell me this. What's your alternative? Wait for Marco to come back and take everything you've got? Sell Marta for pennies on the dollar and still not have enough to save your farm?" The words hit Pedro like a slap, each one cutting closer to the truth he didn't want to face. He looked away, his fists tightening. Victor placed a hand lightly on Pedro's shoulder. "I know it's hard to take a leap of faith, but sometimes it's the only way forward. Think about it, Pedro. This could be your chance to turn everything around." Pedro sat in silence for a long moment, the noise of the tavern fading into the background. His heart raced as he weighed his options, the weight of desperation tipping the scales. Finally, he met Victor's gaze. "All right," Pedro said, his voice low and heavy. "Let's do it." Victor's smile widened and he extended his hand. Pedro hesitated before shaking it, the grip firm and oddly cold. "I'll come by tomorrow," Victor said, standing up and straightening his jacket. "We'll get started right away. You won't regret this." As Victor walked out of the tavern, Pedro stayed behind, staring into his untouched drink. His stomach churned with a mix of hope and unease. Outside, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the promise of a storm. The days after Victor performed the procedure were a blur of relentless effort and fragile hope. Pedro threw himself into preparing for the foal as though his life depended on it, because it did. Every spare coin he had left was spent on Marta's care. He bought premium feed he'd never dreamed of affording before, each sack heavier than the last as he carried it into the barn. He patched up the barn walls, repaired the roof, and reinforced Marta's stall to ensure her safety. By night, he sat by her side, stroking her neck and murmuring words of encouragement. "You're my ticket out of this mess, Marta," he said softly one evening, his voice thick with both desperation and affection. "We'll show them all. You'll have the strongest, healthiest foal anyone's ever seen. Just hang in there, girl." Marta would nuzzle his hand in response, her large dark eyes meeting his with what seemed like understanding. Those moments kept him going, giving him a flicker of belief that things might truly turn around. Pedro allowed himself to dream again. He pictured the foal, strong and proud, its coat gleaming under the sunlight as buyers competed to offer him sums he couldn't even imagine. With that money, he'd save the farm, pay off Marco, and finally breathe freely again. But the cracks in his hope began to show not long after. One morning, Marta refused her feed. Pedro frowned, shaking the bucket gently in front of her, but she only turned her head away, her ears flicking nervously. "It's all right, girl," he said, crouching beside her. "Maybe you're just not feeling it today." But the next day was worse. Marta began pacing her stall, her hooves scraping against the wooden floor in restless, rhythmic thuds. At night, she wouldn't settle, her low, distressed whinnies echoing through the barn. Pedro's heart clenched every time she called out. He sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep with the sound of her unease ringing in his ears. By the end of the week, Marta's ribs were beginning to show, despite Pedro's careful feeding. She'd become skittish, shying away from his touch and huffing nervously when he approached. "What's wrong with you, Marta?" he whispered one evening, standing at the edge of her stall. Marta stared back at him, her body trembling as though she were fighting something unseen. Pedro's concern grew into outright fear. He grabbed his phone and dialed Victor, pacing back and forth in the small kitchen as the line rang. "Come on, pick up," Pedro muttered, his voice laced with frustration. The call went to voicemail. He tried again and again, but there was no answer. The next day, he tried once more, leaving a message this time. "Victor, something's wrong with Marta. She's not eating, she's pacing all night. This isn't normal, is it? You need to come back and check on her, please." There was no response. Pedro clenched the phone in his hand, his breath shaking. He had put all his trust, and what little money he had left, into Victor's promises, and now it felt like the man had vanished into thin air. Reluctantly, Pedro called the local veterinarian. Dr. Ruiz, a kindly older man with a weathered face, arrived the following afternoon. "She's been acting strange for a week now," Pedro explained, walking alongside the vet toward the barn. "Not eating, not sleeping, and she keeps pacing like she's trying to shake something off." Dr. Ruiz frowned, running his hand along Marta's flank and examining her closely. "Her coat's dull," he muttered, mostly to himself. "Breathing seems shallow too," Pedro's stomach churned as Dr. Ruiz continued his examination, his brow furrowing deeper with every passing minute. Pedro's heart sank further with every quiet hum of thought from Dr. Ruiz. The vet pressed a stethoscope against Marta's flank, listening intently. The mare flinched under his touch, her breathing shallow and uneven. "There's something off here," Dr. Ruiz said, his voice hesitant. He glanced at Pedro, concern etched into his weathered face. "But I can't pinpoint it." Pedro's knuckles turned white as he gripped the stall door. "What does that mean? Can you fix it?" Dr. Ruiz shook his head slowly, stepping back to give Marta space. "She's not showing signs of illness that I can treat, at least not with the tools I've got. Her vitals are weak, but not critical, and that pacing you mentioned. It's almost like she's agitated by something we can't see." Pedro clenched his teeth, frustration bubbling just under the surface. "So what am I supposed to do? Just wait and hope she gets better?" The vet hesitated before answering. "I think it's worth getting a more specialized opinion. Maybe someone who can run imaging tests or look for things that might not show up in a physical exam." Pedro nodded, though his mind was already racing. He'd spent almost every dollar he had left on Marta's care. Bringing in another expert wasn't just a gamble. It was a luxury he couldn't afford. 2 weeks passed and Marta's behavior only worsened. Her pacing turned frantic, her hooves scraping against the barn floor until splinters littered the ground. At night, her low whinnies grew louder, more desperate, echoing through the otherwise silent farm. Pedro woke most nights to the sound of her kicking, the thunderous thuds rattling the walls. Each time, he'd rush out to find her soaked in sweat, her eyes wide and unfocused, as if she were battling something invisible. "It's like she's being haunted," Pedro muttered to himself one evening, watching Marta from outside the stall. She had stopped pacing, but now stood motionless, staring into the corner of the barn as if something waited there. Pedro stepped forward, his boots crunching against the straw. "Marta," he said softly, his voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. "It's me." The mare didn't turn. Her ears flicked, but she remained locked in place, her muscles taut. Then, without warning, she let out a shrill, piercing neigh and lunged forward, kicking the stall wall with enough force to split the wood. Pedro stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never seen her like this before. The final straw came late one afternoon. Pedro entered the barn with a bucket of feed, hoping Marta's appetite might return. He approached slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. "Here you go, girl," he said, pouring the grain into the trough. Marta stood still, her head low and her breathing ragged. But as Pedro reached out to stroke her neck, she reared back, letting out a furious neigh. Before Pedro could react, her hind leg lashed out, catching him in the ribs and sending him crashing to the ground. The world tilted as pain radiated through Pedro's side. He gasped, clutching his ribs as Marta stamped her hooves, her wild eyes darting around the barn. He managed to crawl out of the stall, leaning heavily against the wall as he tried to catch his breath. Blood dripped from his lip where he'd bitten it during the fall. "Marta," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What's happening to you?" The next day, Pedro called Juan, an old friend and a retired veterinarian. He hadn't spoken to Juan in years, but desperation outweighed pride. Juan arrived that evening, his truck rumbling up the dirt path. He was older now, his hair streaked with grey, but his sharp eyes hadn't dulled. "Pedro," Juan said, stepping out of the truck. "You sounded worried on the phone." Pedro nodded grimly, leading him toward the barn. "It's Marta. I don't know how to explain it. She's not herself. She's aggressive, restless, and last night she kicked me hard enough to crack a rib." Juan frowned, his expression darkening. "Let me take a look." Inside the barn, Marta stood in her usual corner, her ears flicking nervously as Juan approached. He moved with practiced care, keeping his voice low and steady as he examined her. "She's tense," Juan muttered, running his hands along her flank. When he reached her abdomen, Marta let out a sharp whinny and jerked away, nearly knocking him over. "Easy, girl," Juan said, stepping back. He glanced at Pedro, his brow furrowed. "There's something here. A hard mass. Feels almost unnatural. It's not where the foal should be." Pedro's stomach sank. "What does that mean?" Juan straightened, his expression grave. "I don't know yet. But I can tell you this. It's not normal. We need an ultrasound to get a clearer picture." Pedro nodded, though his heart was pounding. "I'll call Dr. Ruiz again. He might be able to set it up." The ultrasound revealed more than Pedro could have imagined. As the grainy image appeared on the screen, Dr. Ruiz's face turned pale. He pointed to a distinct shape near the foal, a metallic object embedded within Marta's abdomen. "That's not part of her," Dr. Ruiz said, his voice tinged with disbelief. It looks like a device of some sort. A foreign object." Pedro's mind reeled. How did it get there? "Doctor," Ruiz shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's putting her and the foal at risk. I'd recommend getting this removed as soon as possible." "Let's get a closer look," Ruiz muttered, his voice low but tense. Pedro's heart hammered as he stepped closer, unable to tear his eyes from the grainy black and white screen. The vet moved the probe gently across Marta's side, his brows furrowing deeper with each pass. Marta flinched, but held still, her breathing labored. Then Ruiz froze, his hand hovering over the machine's controls. "What?" Pedro asked, his voice cracking. "What is it?" Ruiz didn't answer immediately. He leaned closer to the screen, his fingers tapping a sequence of buttons to adjust the image. "That can't be right," he said softly, almost to himself. Pedro felt the ground sway beneath him. What can't be right? Ruiz straightened and gestured to the screen. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the clearly visible form within Marta's womb. "That's the foal, but it's fully formed." Pedro blinked, struggling to understand. "Fully formed? What do you mean? She's only been pregnant a few weeks." "That's exactly the problem," Ruiz said, his voice now edged with something between disbelief and concern. "Horses take 11 months to gestate. At this stage, we should barely see anything more than a tiny, undeveloped mass. But this..." He motioned to the screen again. "This foal looks like it's been growing for months. It's already complete in form, legs, head, spine, everything." Pedro's knees felt weak. He gripped the edge of the stall for support, his mind racing. How is that possible? Ruiz didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the screen, his expression grim. "It's not natural, Pedro. Something is forcing this foal to grow faster than it should. And I'd bet it's tied to whatever device we saw near the fetus." Pedro's stomach twisted. The metallic object Ruiz had spotted earlier during their initial exam. "Is it dangerous?" Pedro asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruiz nodded grimly. "For both Marta and the foal. Hormonal shifts like this are unnatural and put immense strain on her body. The fact that the foal is this developed already. It's probably why Marta's behavior has been so erratic. Her body's struggling to cope with changes it shouldn't be experiencing this early in the pregnancy. Pedro's throat felt dry. He thought of the pacing, the whinnies, the kicks that had nearly broken her stall door. It wasn't just her behavior, it was a cry for help. "So, what do we do?" Pedro asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Ruiz rubbed the back of his neck, clearly reluctant to answer. "We need to act fast. If we don't figure out how to slow this down or remove whatever's causing it, it could kill her." Pedro barely slept that night, sitting on the creaky bench outside the barn with his head in his hands. Marta's distressed movements echoed from inside, each sound driving a fresh spike of guilt into his chest. Victor. Pedro hadn't heard from him in weeks. His calls went unanswered, his messages ignored. The man who'd promised salvation for his farm had vanished without a trace, leaving only chaos in his wake. "Damn it," Pedro muttered under his breath, slamming his fist against the bench. He knew deep down that Victor had known this would happen. He'd seen it in the man's too slick smile, heard it in the calculated reassurance of his voice. Ruiz's voice echoed in his memory. "It's not natural, Pedro." But Pedro couldn't let Marta die, not after everything. He stood abruptly and marched back into the barn. Marta's head turned toward him, her dark eyes glassy and filled with a pain that made Pedro's chest tighten. "I'll fix this," Pedro said aloud, more for himself than for her. "I swear, I'll fix this." The next morning, Pedro sat with Ruiz in his small clinic office, flipping through stacks of printed research and case files the vet had dug up overnight. "These devices," Ruiz began, pointing to a grainy photo of a chip similar to what they suspected was inside Marta. "They've been found in a few other cases, usually in animals brought in from shady breeding programs or private labs. They're not just trackers, they're meant to alter the animal's biology." Pedro's eyes narrowed. "Alter it how?" "Faster growth, enhanced strength, changes in behavior," Ruiz explained grimly. "Most of the time, the animals don't survive long enough for anyone to study the effects fully." Pedro swallowed hard. "And the foal? What about it?" Ruiz hesitated before answering. "If the chip is accelerating its development, there's no telling how it'll come out. It could be strong and healthy, or it could be severely deformed. Worst case, it might not survive the birth at all." Pedro leaned back in his chair, the weight of the words crushing him. He rubbed his temples, his mind spinning. "So you're saying Marta could die, and the foal might not make it either?" Ruiz nodded. "Unless we can remove the chip and stabilize Marta's condition, it's a strong possibility." Pedro clenched his fists. He thought of the farm, of Marco's looming threats, of the dreams he'd pinned on Marta and her unborn foal. And he thought of Victor. How the man had walked into his life with promises of salvation and left only destruction behind. "What about the police?" Pedro asked suddenly. Ruiz frowned. "What about them?" Pedro sat forward, his jaw set. "If Victor was part of something bigger, one of those labs or organizations, you think they could help. Maybe they know more about what's happening to Marta." Ruiz considered this for a moment, before nodding. "It's worth a shot. If nothing else, they might be able to track him down." Pedro stood, his resolve hardening. "Then we'll call them." By noon, the police were at the clinic, poring over the ultrasound images and Ruiz's notes. One officer, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, turned to Pedro. You said the man who performed the procedure is named Victor Alvarez, she asked. Pedro nodded. That's the name he gave me. I don't know if it's real. The officer exchanged a glance with her partner, a tall, stern man with a scar running down his cheek. We've heard that name before, she said. He's connected to an underground network, labs experimenting on animals to create genetically enhanced specimens. They've been under investigation for years, but they're good at covering their tracks. Pedro's blood ran cold. So, what do we do now? The officer's expression hardened. We find him, and we make sure he doesn't do this to anyone else. As the officers left, Pedro turned to Ruiz, a flicker of hope amid the fear. He couldn't shake the image of Marta's swollen belly, larger and more taut than it had any right to be. Over the past week, her condition had spiraled rapidly. Each day, her belly seemed to expand, the unnatural growth forcing her body to the brink. Every step Marta took looked labored, every breath a struggle. She no longer resembled the strong, spirited mare Pedro had trusted with his last hope. Please, he whispered to the empty air, his hands trembling. Just let her be okay. Let them both be okay. The door creaked open, and Ruiz appeared, his gloves streaked with blood and something darker. His face was set, his eyes grim but determined. We got the chip out, he said. This, Ruiz began, his voice low, was embedded deep, right near the foal. It was releasing some kind of chemical compound, something synthetic that we couldn't fully neutralize. That's what caused the hormonal surge, the rapid growth. Honestly, it's a miracle Marta held on as long as she did. And the foal? Pedro asked, his voice barely steady. Ruiz sighed, setting the chip down on a tray. We need to get it out soon, Pedro. It's fully developed now, more so than I've ever seen in a pregnancy this short. If we wait, the strain might kill them both. The next few hours were a blur of controlled chaos. Ruiz and his assistants moved with purpose, preparing for an emergency C-section to deliver the foal. Pedro stayed by Marta's side until the very last moment, whispering reassurances she couldn't possibly understand, but that he needed to say. You've come this far, girl, he murmured. You're not giving up now. Neither am I. When they finally wheeled her into the operating room, Pedro felt an unbearable emptiness settle over him. He stood in the corridor, staring at the closed doors, listening to the muffled sounds of the team working to save her. Inside, Marta's body trembled under the anesthesia, her heart rate monitored closely. Ruiz worked quickly but carefully, his hands steady as he made the incision. There it is, he said, his voice taut with concentration. The foal was larger than they'd anticipated, its form perfectly developed, as though it had skipped months of gestation. Ruiz gently lifted it out, his team immediately clearing its airways and stimulating its first breath. Seconds stretched into eternity. The foal lay motionless, its tiny chest still. Come on, Ruiz muttered, his gloved hands working to coax life into the newborn. Come on, fight. And then a sound, a faint, trembling whinny that grew stronger with each second. The foal's legs twitched, its eyes blinking open to reveal a startling clarity. Its coat shimmered, a silver hue that seemed almost ethereal under the fluorescent lights. Pedro, Ruiz called, stepping into the hallway. Pedro rushed forward, his heart pounding. When he saw the foal, his breath caught. She's beautiful, he whispered, kneeling beside the tiny creature. The foal's gaze met his, and for a moment, Pedro felt something he couldn't explain. An understanding, a connection deeper than anything he'd experienced before. Is Marta... He couldn't finish the question. Ruiz placed a hand on his shoulder. "She's stable, Pedro. She pulled through, but she's going to need time to recover, and so will this little one." Pedro nodded, tears stinging his eyes. He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered over the foal's small, sturdy body. When he finally touched her, he felt the warmth of life, strong and undeniable. "Estrella," he said softly, "that's your name. You're our star." Back in the barn that evening, Pedro sat between Marta and Estrella, his heart full despite the exhaustion weighing him down. Marta nuzzled the foal gently, her strength slowly returning. Pedro leaned back against the stall, watching as Estrella stood on wobbly legs for the first time, her tiny hooves clicking against the straw. She let out a soft whinny, turning to Marta for reassurance. "You both made it," Pedro said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're tougher than I ever could have imagined." As the night deepened, the barn grew quiet, save for the soft sounds of mother and foal resting. Pedro allowed himself to close his eyes for the first time in weeks, feeling a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. The police station hummed with tension as Pedro sat in a cold metal chair, staring at the small chip encased in a sterile plastic bag on the table before him. The object seemed impossibly small to have caused so much destruction. His hands trembled as he laced his fingers together, his thoughts a storm of guilt and dread. Across from him, Detective Morales leaned forward, her sharp eyes never leaving Pedro's face. The fluorescent lights overhead reflected off her badge, casting a faint glow on the table. "This chip," Morales began, tapping the bag lightly with her pen, "is more than just a tracking device. It's a sophisticated piece of technology capable of altering an animal's biology. We've seen similar devices before, but this one? It's advanced, way beyond what we've dealt with before." Pedro swallowed hard, his voice barely steady. "What does that mean? What exactly were they doing to Marta?" Morales sighed, leaning back in her chair. "The organization behind this chip, they're part of an international network. We've been tracking them for years. Their goal is to create genetically enhanced animals for profit. Workhorses capable of laboring in extreme conditions, biologically modified creatures for military use, even animals bred to produce compounds for experimental medicine. Marta and her foal were their latest experiments." Pedro's stomach churned. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. "I didn't know. I never would have agreed to this if I'd known." His voice broke, and he looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Morales softened slightly, but pressed on. "You might not have known, Pedro, but they used you. They saw your desperation, your need to save your farm, and they exploited it. That's what they do. They prey on people like you, people with nothing left to lose." Pedro felt a wave of shame wash over him. The room felt colder, the walls closing in around him. "So, what happens now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Morales exchanged a glance with her partner, a tall, stoic man named Ramirez. Ramirez folded his arms and spoke for the first time. "We've identified one of their key facilities. It's on the outskirts of town, an old warehouse repurposed into a lab. If we act quickly, we can shut them down before they relocate. But we need your help." Pedro's head shot up. "My help? What can I do?" Morales leaned forward again, her tone steady but firm. "The chip we pulled from Marta has unique identifiers, serial numbers, data points that could lead us to their supply chain. But we also need intel on the man who implanted it. Victor Alvarez. You were his last known contact. Anything you can tell us, no matter how small, could make the difference." Pedro nodded slowly, the weight of his responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. "I'll tell you everything I know, whatever it takes to stop this." Hours later, Pedro stood in the shadows near the edge of the identified facility, watching as the police team prepared to breach. The air was thick with anticipation. The only sounds the faint rustling of gear and the distant hum of machinery from within the warehouse. Morales approached him, her expression serious. "You stay here, Pedro. This is going to get dangerous." Pedro nodded, his jaw tight. "Just bring them down. Make sure they can't hurt anyone or anything else." Morales gave a curt nod before signaling to her team. Inside the warehouse, the scene was more horrifying than Pedro had imagined. Rows of cages lined the walls, each one holding an animal in various states of distress. Horses, dogs, even livestock, all marked with the telltale signs of experimentation. Some were lethargic, their bodies emaciated. Others paced frantically, their eyes wild with fear. In the center of the facility, a bank of monitors displayed live feeds of other labs around the world, each screen showing similar scenes of cruelty. Scientists in lab coats moved quickly between stations, oblivious to the silent approach of the police. Morales and her team moved with precision, fanning out to secure the area. One officer signaled to Morales, pointing to a man near the back of the lab. Victor Alvarez. Victor was hunched over a workstation, his focus entirely on the glowing screen before him. He didn't notice the team until Morales' voice cut through the air like a blade. "Victor Alvarez, you're under arrest." Victor froze for a split second before bolting toward a side door. Morales and Ramirez gave chase, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the warehouse. Pedro watched from his hiding spot outside as Victor burst through the exit, only to be tackled by Ramirez moments later. The man struggled, shouting obscenities and threats, but he was quickly subdued and handcuffed. Back in the warehouse, the team uncovered a trove of evidence. Documents detailing experiments, lists of clients interested in purchasing genetically enhanced animals, and blueprints for more advanced chips. Morales approached Pedro as the team began loading the confiscated equipment into trucks. "Thanks to you, Pedro. We've made a huge dent in their operation. It's not over, but this is a big step." Pedro nodded, his expression grim. "What about the animals? The ones in there? Can they be saved?" Morales hesitated before answering. "We're coordinating with animal rescue organizations. Some might recover, but many won't." Pedro closed his eyes, the weight of it all pressing down on him. But as he thought of Marta and Estrella, a spark of determination flickered within him. "I'll take them," he said suddenly. Morales frowned. "Take who?" "The ones who can be saved," Pedro clarified. "Bring them to my farm. I'll take care of them." Morales looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, Pedro. We'll make the arrangements." The moon hung low over the quiet countryside, casting a silvery glow on Pedro's farm. It was well past midnight when the first truck rolled into the yard, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Pedro stood by the barn door, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, bracing himself for the task ahead. Inside the truck, the air was thick with tension. Ruiz and Juan sat in the back, murmuring quietly as they monitored the condition of the rescued horses. Most of the animals were motionless, their bodies battered and frail from months, possibly years, of experimentation. A few whinnied weakly, their voices haunting in the stillness of the night. The truck stopped, its brakes hissing softly. Pedro stepped forward as the doors swung open. Ruiz jumped out first, his face grim but determined. "We've got 10 here," Ruiz said, his voice low but steady. 5 are critical. A couple. He hesitated, looking away. A couple might not make it through the night. Pedro nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Let's get to work." The barn became a makeshift clinic, with tables and equipment hurriedly set up to treat the injured animals. Juan moved swiftly, his years of veterinary experience evident in the way he handled each horse with a mix of precision and compassion. Pedro worked alongside him, his calloused hands steady despite the whirlwind of emotions churning inside him. One by one, the horses were brought in, each one bearing the scars of what they had endured. Some had deep lacerations around their necks, likely from the restraints used during the experiments. Others showed signs of malnourishment, their ribs jutting sharply against their dull coats. The worst were those with chips embedded in their flesh. Ruiz worked meticulously to extract the devices, his tools glinting under the barn's dim overhead lights. "This one's bad," Ruiz muttered, leaning over a grey mare that barely had the strength to lift her head. The chip, lodged deep near her spine, had caused a massive infection. He motioned for Pedro to hold the horse steady as he carefully removed the device. The mare let out a soft whimper, her body shuddering. "Hang on, girl," Pedro murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "We've got you now." By dawn, the team had treated 8 of the 10 horses. 3 had passed away during the night, their frail bodies unable to withstand the trauma. Pedro stood over one of them, a chestnut stallion, his shoulders heavy with grief. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I'm so sorry." Ruiz placed a hand on Pedro's shoulder. "You did everything you could," he said quietly. "They're not suffering anymore." Pedro nodded, his jaw tight. He turned back to the remaining horses, his resolve hardening. The sun was rising as they finished tending to the last horse, a young filly with striking black and white markings. Despite her injuries, she seemed alert, her eyes bright as she nuzzled Pedro's hand. "She's a fighter," Juan said, smiling faintly. Pedro scratched behind the filly's ear, a small spark of hope flickering within him. "She reminds me of Estrella," he said. In the corner of the barn, Marta and Estrella watched the scene unfold. Marta, still recovering from her own ordeal, stood protectively over her foal, her eyes filled with quiet strength. Estrella trotted forward, curious about the new arrivals. Pedro crouched beside the foal, running a hand along her silvery coat. "You've got some new friends now," he said softly, "and they need you to show them how to fight." The story of the rescue spread quickly, with news crews arriving at Pedro's farm within days. Journalists clamored for interviews, their cameras capturing the resilience of Marta and Estrella, as well as the harrowing conditions of the rescued horses. Pedro spoke carefully during each interview, his voice steady but passionate as he recounted the horrors uncovered during the police raid. "These animals deserve better," he said, standing in front of the barn with Estrella at his side. "They're not just tools for profit. They're living beings with strength, courage, and so much to give." The footage aired nationwide, sparking outrage and galvanizing public support for stronger animal protection laws. Organizations like the Humane Society and local rescue groups reached out to Pedro, offering resources and funding to support the farm's transformation into a rehabilitation center. Months later, the farm had become a sanctuary. The barn, once a place of quiet struggle, now buzzed with life and purpose. Volunteers worked alongside Pedro and his team, caring for the rescued horses and helping them regain their strength. Marta, though older and slower, remained a steady presence, her calm demeanor soothing even the most skittish animals. Estrella, now a yearling, had grown into a spirited and intelligent young horse, her energy infectious. Visitors flocked to the farm to see her, inspired by her story of survival and the hope she represented. Pedro walked through the fields one evening, watching the horses graze under the fading light. He stopped by a small memorial they had built for the horses who hadn't survived, a simple stone plaque surrounded by wildflowers. "You didn't make it," he said softly, his voice tinged with sadness. "But you didn't die in vain. Because of you, things are changing." The farm's reputation grew beyond anything Pedro had imagined. It became a symbol of resilience and redemption, attracting support from across the globe. Schools organized field trips to teach children about animal welfare, and lawmakers visited to discuss policies inspired by Pedro's efforts. But even as the farm flourished, Pedro remained humble, his focus always on the animals. Late at night, he would sit outside Marta's stall, his hand resting gently on her neck as Estrella dozed nearby. "You saved me as much as I saved you," he would tell her, maybe even more. Marta would nicker softly in response, her eyes warm and knowing. Though the fight against the underground network continued, Pedro found solace in the impact they had already made. The farm was no longer just a place of survival. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of perseverance and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. As he watched Estrella gallop across the pasture, her silvery coat gleaming in the sunlight, Pedro smiled. She was his star, his guiding light. And with her by his side, he knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Hey there, friends. So, what did you think about Pedro's story? Pretty intense, right? First off, let me say this loud and clear. This is a work of fiction. But even though it's not real, the messages it carries feel incredibly human, don't they? That's what I love about storytelling. It gives us the chance to explore deep, meaningful lessons in ways that really hit home. Pedro's journey is a powerful reminder of resilience and the strength of the human spirit. It's about how far someone will go to protect what they love, even when the odds seem impossibly stacked against them. From the heartbreak of desperation to the hope that comes with new beginnings, this story dives deep into what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. And Marta, oh, what a symbol of perseverance she is. Her bond with Pedro shows us that compassion and care can overcome even the darkest challenges. But beyond the drama and the tension, this story also shines a light on the importance of speaking out against injustice, especially when it comes to those who can't defend themselves, like animals in this case. It's a call to action for empathy and responsibility, and honestly, I think we could all use a little more of that in our world today. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the story resonated with you the most? Did it inspire you in some way? Let's talk about it in the comments. And hey, if you enjoyed this story or found its message meaningful, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Thanks for being here with me. Until next time, take care of yourselves and keep spreading those good vibes.